Hello, my name is Miriam Löfgren. I'm also known as Engraved online. I am a digital illustrator, and today I will show you how to make objects such as armor to look rich, detailed, and ornate by adding engraving to it using the digital art software Clip Studio. You can use any brushes for this, but the ones I have used in this tutorial will be linked in the description below. There are different ways to add details to artwork. They all are useful, but depending on your own art style, you might prefer some methods over others. So I will show you the different methods that I use, mainly for a digital painterly style. But even if it might not fit your style, I still encourage you to give these a try. Engraving is a pattern, picture, or text carved onto a surface. Usually it is metal. It is mainly a form of decorating areas to make them look more appealing. The opposite of engraving is embossing. These are patterns and text that are added onto the surface. To achieve a convincing result, you need to pay attention to the light source. Just by changing it, as shown here, it can turn from engraved to looking embossed. Using layer modes on different surfaces. Engraving can be done on any type of surface, but it is good to be aware of how it looks on matte versus shiny versus reflected objects. What separates a shiny object from a matte one is mainly the reflective light is more visible, which we can see especially on the bottom part of the middle sphere. The highlights and core shadows are also sharper and higher in contrast. A reflective surface goes so far that it reflects the surroundings just like a mirror. So the more reflective the surface, the more do you have to include the surrounding colors in your illustration. Now, if we give each sphere here a deep cut along the surface, we can see that it gives a different look on each one. For the matte sphere, we can pretty much only use a multiply layer, but for the other two, we have to take the reflective light into account. For the shiny sphere, I set the line layer to normal and lock transparent pixels. Then I use a soft airbrush to add a variety of darker shadows along the line. One rule of thumb: only darken areas that are lighter than the midtone. For example, the reflected light at the bottom of the sphere and areas close to the highlights are places where I would make the line a little bit darker. We will do similar with the reflective sphere, but instead of doing it on a normal layer, let's set the layer to difference. If it doesn't give the right look right away, adjust the luminosity until it looks something similar to the image here. Usually white or a very light gray should do the trick. Depending on what colors or values you work with, you can get a similar result if you set the layer to exclusion. And the layer mode difference works pretty good for pattern brushes that has a lot of details and thin lines. There are a lot of beautiful pattern brushes to download on Clip Studio Assets. I really recommend it for finding inspiration and resources. Engraving manually by hand. Painting engraving manually by hand is useful when you don't think other methods match your own style that well. It is also a good practice if you are a beginner to this. Make sure to first determine the light source, which is where the highlight should follow. Next stage is to add engraving. Create a multiply layer and use a medium gray color to draw the patterns. You can also use a normal layer and use black on low opacity for a similar result. Make sure the pattern follows the shape of the object. Then make a normal layer above the multiply layer and add the highlighted parts. Pay close attention to the light source here. Both the main light source as well as the reflected light are used on the sphere in the example shown. This is the simple way to add engraving manually without relying too much on layer modes. You can also use this method for creating shallow cracks in rocks and marble sculptures. Using patterned brushes. You can of course use brushes with custom patterns to save some time. But if there's too many details, it can actually take even more time if you're going to add all the highlights manually by hand. One trick is to make a copy of the pattern layer and color it white, then move the layer a tiny bit up or down depending on your light source. Layer modes such as color dodge and glow dodge can also be useful here. Complex shapes. As for more complex shapes, make sure to use a reference if needed. Here I sketched out a grid in red and blue, which would work as a guide, mainly for the light and shadow and reflection. This will determine the shape that will later on also be work as an additional guide for when I apply the engraving. You can also add the engraving right away in the sketching stage, but I usually do this at the end of the process. Applying onto your artwork. Engraving is something you often add at the end of the process, and as long as you keep it on a separate layer, you should have enough room for adjustments if needed. I first start by painting most of the artwork. As for metal, I find it easiest to first use a soft round airbrush and then render it into sharper brushwork using a blending brush. I usually don't do this in black and white, but I think for this tutorial it is actually useful to do this first in grayscale because it puts more focus on the rendering and paying a close attention to the values and light and reflections. And I picked a light background here to make the armor and the feather thing stand out more in contrast. And I had to take that into account as well when I render the shiny armor. I first use manual engraving along the edges of the armor, since it will look more deep and match the overall brushing style. It will also serve as a template for when I add more intricate details later. And you can also see here when I add the little highlights what a big difference it makes right away. And it suddenly goes from just being lines to actually have some sort of depth and form, and it adds so much to the armor already at this stage. And as for the more intricate ornaments, I just used one of the default ribbon brushes that comes with the program. And I also blurred them a little bit so it would blend in a bit more to the art style of this painting, because sometimes these ribbon brushes are very sharp or aren't aliased enough. So and yeah, for that I just locked the layer and adjusted the values after the armor it is on. And here I am adjusting the values and adding some more colors on a separate layer. You can use layer mode color or overlay, and when you feel like you've got the base colors down, you can make another layer and just paint on top of that using color picking and blending. So, and for this artwork, I didn't want to make it too saturated, except for the red feathers here. Sometimes you can use, saturation as your point of focus. And since this is now in color, I have to take the surrounding colors into account, and that is why I am adding a little bit of hints of red here, because it is the red reflection of the feathers that are reflected onto the very shiny armor here. Lastly, I drew some bigger ornaments, but instead of a multiply layer, I set it to linear burn and used a light blue-gray color. Then I duplicated it, set it to color dodge, and moved the layer a little bit to the side. One thing to keep in mind when you do this is that if you're going to really cover the entire armor or character, using this engraving drawing technique is that you are going to end up with quite a lot of layers. There's going to be a lot of copy and pasting, and I recommend color coding your layers so you have some control over this. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I wish you all a happy painting.